So far, here's what we've built. We have a host. That host is a simple console mode application. We have a server. The server is provided by Katana components that work with HTTP Listener and the operating system to receive HTTP requests. We also have a Katana and Owen middleware layer. So far, we've built middleware that just says hello and another piece that dumps an environment to the console. But we want something more. We want an application that will serve up meaningful data. We could do this by adding an application framework, for example, something like the open source Nancy, because Nancy knows how to route requests and includes a view engine and lots of other features. We can also use the Web API. Both Nancy and Web API have an advantage over ASP.NET MVC because neither of them have a dependency on system.web or ASP.NET. We can be lean and mean and hosted in a console application with no overhead. Let's see how that can work. Back with Visual Studio, I would like a request that comes to my application to the path /API/greeting, not to be processed by the middleware that just writes out a plain text hello. I would like this to be handled by the Web API to actually have it serialize an object into XML or JSON and return that result. Fortunately, this is fairly easy. The first thing I need to do is install a package that will patch the Web API into the Owen pipeline and give it a chance to route requests to a Web API controller. So I want to install a package, again, a pre-release package. This one is microsoft.aspnet.webapi.owen self-host. When I install that package, it will have a dependency on other Web API packages like webapi.client and .core, as well as JSON.NET, which it uses for serialization. And I now have Web API references in my project. So now let me come in and add something for the Web API to serialize. Do Control-Shift-A. I want to add a class. Let's call this class greeting. I'll make this very simple. It will be a public class that has one property, a property called text. And of course, I could add as many other properties there as I wanted to. I could add a timestamp, add an ID, but let's just keep something simple for right now. And I'll add one more class, which is going to be a Web API controller. And I'll call this greeting controller. So if you haven't worked with the Web API before, there's a lot of good coverage on Pluralsight. I also have a module on the Web API in my MVC4 Fundamentals course, and all of that information is still relevant with this version of the Web API, version 2. But to write a Web API controller, I derive from API controller. That's in system.web.http namespace. And to respond to an HTTP GET request, I just need a method on here that starts with the word GET. It's going to return a greeting. So let me just return a new greeting object whose text is set to hello world. So that's my controller. That's the model object that I want serialized. Everything else comes down to configuration. Let me remove this code that we commented out that was dumping out the environment. And after our first piece of middleware, let's call into a method called configure web API that takes that app. And I can create that method with Visual Studio, generate a method stub for it. And inside of here, the first thing I need to do really is configure the web API itself. And to do that in a self-hosted application, I need to create a new instance of the HTTP configuration class that's in system.web.http. This is the configuration object that controls the routing rules, that controls the serializers and the formatters. Really, the one thing I need it for are the routing rules. I need to configure a new route. So I want to map an HTTP route. We'll just call it the default API route. This is very similar to what you see in a new MVC application, the code that it emits as the default web API configuration. The template for this route is going to be API/the controller name. And if we want to make it just like a new project template, we could also have the optional ID parameter. And so I could specify the defaults here as give me an object where ID equals route parameter, not optional. Let me just format this so it all fits on the screen. But now that I have the Web API configured, it knows how to respond to incoming requests, or at least requests that come into API/something. I can tell the app builder that I want to use Web API. So just like we built a custom extension method that allowed people to plug in our Hello World component really easily, the Web API Owen package includes a use Web API extension method for app builder that allows me to plug in the Web API easily. The one piece of information it needs, though, is that HTTP configuration. And with that, I should be able to launch the server once again. Let's come over and request /API/greeting. And here you can see two interesting pieces of information. First of all, in the browser window, I successfully reached that greeting controller. It created a greeting model. It serialized it into XML. And I can see that XML in the browser, so that part works. Over in the server window, you can see the middleware is still working. That logging piece of middleware says someone's requesting /API/greeting, and we responded with a 200 status code. What happens if I go somewhere else in the application? Let's say to the root. Well, now this particular request goes all the way to my Hello World component. It has decided to respond. It responds to every request unless something else responds first. And when I go to /API/greeting, because the Web API is configured in here, and that matches a route that it knows how to respond to, it was able to supply a response, and it never needed to call down into additional middleware components. Just like the Hello World component never calls additional components later in the pipeline, the Web API says, I know how to process this request. It runs the request through the Web API pipeline, and that produced a result, which is this XML. And now I have an application level framework plugged into Katana. Still self-hosted, still in a console application, still very lightweight, but now I can respond to meaningful URLs with meaningful data.